we don't right now know exactly what will be the evolution of this potential trade war. Senior officials led by Treasury Secretary Mnuchin have been saying they're trying to dampen down. By the same token, the Chinese side has been announcing which sectors they might hit. The Trump White House has been declaring what damage they're going to do and what kind of penalties they're going to levy on Chinese exports. So we can't tell exactly how big it could be. But the U.S.-China trade relationship is enormous. And the repercussions of a trade war between the two could spill over, really would have to spill over to affect other relations in Asia, other transatlantic relationships, relationships in emerging markets. So the potential for damage, if this does get out of control, is very large. There's quite an array of issues. Right now, the United States, but the world, is concerned about oversupply of steel and aluminum. Much of that is because of overcapacity in China, but everybody could be affected. We import steel and aluminum from Canada, from Mexico, from European countries. If there are tariffs put on steel and aluminum, that will affect all kinds of trans-Pacific and transatlantic relationships, as well as just the U.S.-China relationship. The agenda of complaints against China is quite long, and it extends well beyond current questions of oversupply of steel and aluminum. There have been expressions of concern about entire sectors. For example, the semiconductor sector. And there have been CFIUS, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, cases that have turned away prospective acquisitions, Chinese acquisitions of American or of European, in one case a German semiconductor company. That's CFIUS in the United States ruling against Chinese acquisition of a German firm. That's a little bit extended and complex. And yes, by singling out entire sectors as being sacrosanct, there is another disturbing development, and that is the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States is being instructed now in the Trump days, in the Trump era, to ensure commercial superiority of the United States in various sectors. Like artificial intelligence, like semiconductors, like IT. Well, the tradition in the past has seen international trade and investment relations as a win-win phenomenon. That is to say, it isn't that one side wins and one side loses, it's that both sides win together from greater flows of trade and investment. This approach to ensuring commercial superiority is going back to the mercantilist idea that excuse me, is going back to the mercantilist idea that one side has to win and the other side has to lose. And Trump, with his slogan America First, is nurturing that mercantilist zero-sum perspective. Your viewers should know that I serve on the International Advisory Board of Huawei, and take that into account. I am familiar with the company, I'm familiar with its leadership, I'm familiar with its governance structure. It is a privately owned company, although it is accused in the United States of serving the purposes of the Chinese government, not just being a private Chinese company. Well, in the United Kingdom, Huawei is quite widely accepted. Why? Because it has a good reputation of hardware, software. It can be one of the backbones of British telecom, British IT policy. Similarly, in many states in the European Union, they rely on Huawei equipment, Huawei software. They are not concerned about penetration of Huawei equipment or software by the Chinese government. In fact, Huawei has in the United Kingdom a special laboratory that has been set up by the equivalent of the NSA, the National Security Agency. It doesn't go by that name in the UK, but it is the equivalent that tests out and certifies that Huawei equipment and Huawei programs are bug-free, are surveillance-free. So that is one of the reasons why they're very reassuring. On the other hand, in the United States, CFIUS has disapproved of Huawei acquisitions, and now the Federal Trade Commission has been telling regional networks in the United States not to use Huawei equipment. So there really is, as you point out, a big disparity between the way Huawei is accepted in, say, the UK and other parts of Europe and how it is being rejected in the United States. I agree with the British view that they are reliable and they are dependable. I don't think it's just that they have a bad image, it's that there are officials in the United States that are suspicious without offering any evidence. I have to say, there have been reports and allegations. There has never been any evidence offered that Huawei allows surveillance, backdoors, trapdoors, any kind of malware in its products. CFIUS makes judgments about foreign acquisitions, not just Chinese acquisitions, but any foreign acquisition. There have been some Israeli acquisitions, some French acquisitions, other acquisitions that have raised concerns, not just China or Russian acquisitions. But prior to FINSA, prior to the reform, this was a very politicized process. That is to say, congressional committees could get involved in trying to make it so that foreign companies could not operate in the United States or could not buy U.S. companies. FINSA regularized that and said the sole body that can make judgments about national security cases is CFIUS. Now, Congress, you can't prevent Congress from having hearings, you can't prevent Congress from making public statements, but it was a bit of a regularization and formalization of the process of judging whether or not there are genuine national security threats or, in some cases, allegations. Because I have to tell you, I mean, we have to be realistic about this. Many times acquisitions are brought up by rival U.S. companies who would like to acquire the target firm themselves. So they go to congressional committees, they go to the press, and they allege that Huawei poses a national security risk. It is purely because they want a cheaper target for themselves. That isn't always the case. There are some cases where there are genuine concerns. Again, I think frequently overblown or non-existent. But there is a kind of commercial dynamic behind some of these allegations. I think that the current CFIUS process, which looks at specific potential national security threats for specific individual transactions, is the appropriate approach. Some of the, quote, reform efforts are, as we discussed earlier, to exclude entire sectors like the semiconductor sector. But Senator Grassley, for example, and Senator Stabenow want something they call food security, which means they want foreigners to be kept out of U.S. agribusiness acquisitions. So, and then others talk about energy security, that foreigners should not be allowed to take over American energy companies. Well, the list gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, your viewers should know, and we probably should include this statement toward the beginning, that foreign investment in the United States brings high-paying jobs, high value added, cutting-edge technology, and indeed induces spillovers that help the productivity of the entire U.S. economy. So when Siemens, the German company, invests in the United States, whether it's by acquisition or by greenfield investment — greenfield means they just come and build their own plant — when Philips, the electronics company, when Samsung, the Korean electronics company, when Fujitsu, when Japanese companies come and build plants in the United States, these are high-paying jobs. They're very productive jobs. They do more higher than average R&D. They're very research and development intensive. So this is a valuable segment. So denying the ability of foreign investors to invest in the United States, even in the case of China or Russia or Israel or France, or, I mean, a Canadian company probably isn't going to raise any concerns. A UK company isn't. But, you know, once you allow protectionism to come into investment relations, not just trade relations, then you can have a snowball effect that is very detrimental to the U.S. economy. Well, the United States has the most experienced and the most sophisticated set of regulations. Europe, for example, both Europe at the EU level and individual countries, for example, Germany, are just beginning to think about developing their own screening system. They don't have the same kind of experience. Whether or not they might head in the direction of defining entire sectors as off limits, or whether they might do the current CFIUS approach of transaction by transaction screening is not clear. But it is very much on the table. it's a important big piece of legislation, but let me make just 3 points. One is that this new, quote, reformed, I don't like the term reformed, but this change in CFIUS would allow exclusion of foreign acquisitions in entire sectors, not just individual cases, but entire sectors. We've already covered that, but that is one of the characteristics of this bill. The second, which we also mentioned, is that the aim would be to ensure U.S. technological superiority. This gets back to what we said about whether or not you have a zero-sum view of trade and investment or you have a win-win approach to trade and investment. Third, and we have not mentioned this, is that the, quote, reform that Senator Cornyn and Representative Pottinger, they both support the same. He's in the House, Senator Cornyn, of course, is in the Senate, would allow CFIUS to disapprove of many kinds of commercial intellectual property business relationships that are just part of licensing IPR, intellectual property rights, or forming joint ventures between companies, or allowing technology transfer as part of a normal business relationship, not a national security issue. So this could be very intrusive in the operating of the U.S. economy. First and foremost is the violation of intellectual property rights. China is a big IPR violator. That is to say, they don't license technology, they don't pay for technology, they just copy it, they pirate it. That is a major objection. Second is the Chinese authorities often force foreign investors, the United States, European, Japanese, or South Korean investors, to share their technology or to form mandatory partnerships with Chinese companies. And the American companies can't refuse. Well, I don't want to just say American companies. So if Boeing wants to operate in China, they have to operate with a state-owned Chinese partner. Excuse me. By the same token, if Airbus wants to operate in China, or Embraer, the Brazilian aerospace company, they have to operate with a Chinese partner and they have to share technology. Well, they do this because they want into the Chinese market, but they don't do so willingly. And this is a deliberate attempt to force the transfer of technology. So those two issues, intellectual property theft and then forced technology transfer, are big objections that American companies and, I say, European and other Asian companies have about operating in China. This takes us to the question, many senators, for example, led by Chuck Schumer, have said, well, we want reciprocal treatment, and we're not going to allow Chinese companies to come and operate in the United States unless we get reciprocal open treatment in China. Well, that's a very powerful argument, level playing field. On the other hand, I think it is going to be a very long, hard process to actually persuade Chinese authorities not to try and transfer technology. China has something, it is a plan called Made in China 2025. And that is designed to try and ensure that China catches up with Europe, Japan, and South Korea, and the United States across an entire spectrum of high technology industries. So they are very much on the path of trying to design an industrial policy to bolster their own presence. They're not going to give up on that. And the only way to try and get a more level playing field is going to have to be a multilateral approach. That is to say, the Trump administration, no matter how often they say America first, they have to work. The United States, whoever is president, has to work with the Europeans and with our Asian allies to present a united front to try and get a more level playing field. Well, my hope is that we can avoid the escalation into a trade and investment protection war. I think that the United States is going to have to work with its allies on a multilateral basis to try and get more of a level playing field. As I pointed out, there are genuine complaints that American, British, French, German, Japanese, Korean companies have with the way they are treated in China. So there is work to be done, but it has to be done on a multilateral basis and hopefully without an escalation into protectionism on both sides.